Hey y'all, welcome back. Professor Jensen here. In our video this week, we are going to take a little bit of time to talk about the basics of starting to lay out the user interface of an Android assignment or an Android project. Just as a couple of notes though, before we get started into how this all works, I want to take just a minute and talk about why this is important for you. Now, as a faculty member, we have a group of individuals. We call them our Industry Advisory Council. Essentially, these are a sampling of companies around the area who are likely or who have been hiring Weber State graduates in the past. And it gives us an opportunity to meet with them and say, okay, tell us what are you looking for in your graduates. And I've got a group of them that do Android development professionally. That are hiring our students to do Android development, that they do Android development for all of their full-time jobs. And as I've talked to them, a couple of things have come to light that they really want students to learn. And one of those is the ability and the need, the necessity, I guess, to understand how to do layouts. It doesn't necessarily have to, you guys don't have to figure out necessarily all the colors and how to make it look shiny, but you need to make it look decent. You need to be able to how to do some of those layouts and especially understand the performance and the way that interfaces and affects the way you lay things out. So we're going to spend some time in this video. One of the other topics that they've requested we spend a substantial amount of time talking about is fragments, which is what we are going to do starting in our next video. So this first video, we're going to talk just about basic layouts, and then we'll take those concepts and start applying them to fragments. And how do we work with fragments? And we're going to dive headlong into layouts and fragments and slowly start building up levels of interaction in our applications. Now, one thing I do want to take a little side note as well and just mention really quickly is every semester I talk to students about things that they struggled. There's when I'm leading evals after the end. As I mentioned in the last video, for example, the life cycle is one that comes up a lot. Another thing that came up quite frequently with students is they expected last week to be the rest of the semester. Last week was pretty easy, if we're honest. It's designed just to make sure we get all the issues sorted out with your IDE. So if you didn't have any issues with your IDE, you probably thought, oh, sweet, this is easy. The rest of the semester is going to be a breeze. Well, we're in an upper division programming class now, and that's not the way that it's going to be for the rest of the semester. I'm sorry to tell you that, but that's just how it's going to be. So we're going to push you far because this is your only Android class we offer right now. I'm trying to get some later stuff in, but in the meantime, we got to work with what we got, and that's just this one class. So we're gonna push you hard. We're gonna take you far. But at the end of the semester, every one of my students has said, it was a lot harder in the end than I thought it was going to be, but it was completely worth it because of how much we were able to learn and do by the end of it. My goal is to get you out there able to do app development, to have enough basics under you that you understand what's going on, that you can go pick up things you maybe didn't learn in the class, but that you can go out and start writing applications. So make sure you start planning time accordingly because this class is going to take some time, especially in an online format. It's going to take a little bit of extra time because we don't have lecture time. And it'll take more dedication from you. So if you're trying to, if you're wanting to be one of those students that comes in just on a Sunday afternoon or maybe even just a Saturday, you're going to find that is not a sufficient amount of time. And I've had student after student tell me that it's got to be something you got to work on throughout the week. Android is a complicated topic. So I'll get off that soapbox now, but just to lay that out in your head. Okay, that to make some of those expectations, that it's going to take a little bit of effort and work from you guys to get to where you want to be. So, in the meantime, though, let's get started, shall we? So, we're going to just start up a new Android Studio project. I'm going to call this Layout Demo. And again, targeting API 21, which gives us a pretty good range. Now, too, I noticed, in the discussion, some of you have asked, well, why don't we target some of the newer APIs that allow us to have some of the fancier features? Well, we want to target starting at API 21 and later, because the reality is when you get out into the real world, and this is just a sad side effect of Android development right now, the Android engineering team is working on some changes that would change this problem substantially, but as it is, a lot of manufacturers take a long time to push out an Android update, if they ever do, to devices after they've been released. They're still used to the old school world. When you used to get a dumb phone like an old Nokia, they wrote an OS for it once and then it never left. They never changed anything after the fact. And some of those legacy style approaches, I'm looking at you, Samsung, still haven't fully adapted to this new world we live in. So the reality is, and again, this is coming from Industry Advisory Council, they want you to learn to be able to think in terms of device coverage and getting an application out there that a lot of people can use, again, because that's how you're going to make money. And sometimes that will mean a particular application needs a specific feature and you're going to have to target higher, and sometimes you may even target lower than Android 5 Lollipop. But this gives you a pretty solid spread of devices that you can cover. So that's where we're going to do this, is it kind of gives us that good balance that we're looking for to begin with. So we're going to start off with an empty activity application, just basics, and we're going to hit finish, and we're going to let this Gradle build run. And while this Gradle build runs, the idea behind our project this week, or in this video I should say, is to start to see how we can lay things out in a way on the screen so that we can put things, maybe we need to put things side by side, maybe on top of each other, and start to design for flexibility, I guess. Because one of the things that can be a little tricky for Android, and it doesn't make sense to me why this part students struggle with, but they do, so we got to just work with what we got, is that when you're laying out layouts, okay, so many different Android devices all have different screen resolutions. Some will be taller, some will be wider, some will have, this ratio and that ratio, and they're not even necessarily even the same screen ratios, let alone the same screen dimensions. So unlike when you're designing, applications for other environments where you can say, well, I'm going to set this fixed size, that's not the way it works in Android. You'll find that layouts in Android are going to feel a lot like what you did for web development, where you have to start to think in terms of percentages, and this thing should take half the screen, this thing should take a third of the screen, and then let the operating system do the work underneath the hood. Okay, especially whatever your dimension is that happens to be the width. You never want to hard code that width if you can help it, because especially that's the thing that changes a lot. We can wrap things in a scroll view, for example, and the user can slide up and down to make things fit in a vertical format. But when it comes time to that horizontal dimension, things don't usually slide in that direction. And the odds are users are going to be using your application on a different device. I mean, even me, when you're developing things, I'm going to be testing on different device and sizes and things than you are. So just be aware of that as you're laying out your layouts, to let Android figure out the final target sizes rather than you hard coding things in as much as you can. Okay? Alright, so with that said, we are going to open up our layout. Now there's a couple of different ways we can get to the layout of our application. Number one, if you see this little icon right here, this allows us to shortcut directly to the XML file that this main activity is using. So if we want, we can use that way, and this will take us to us here. Or we can come through resources, layouts, and open the layout that way as well. Okay. Now there is an issue that we've run into starting in the last couple of weeks since Google released some new code. So we're going to just approach this one head on. Then if you come to here, you'll notice nothing is showing up. Even if I go to the text, though, I can see I should have a hello world showing up here, but it's not. Okay. In fact, you can see if we come here to this little exclamation point at the top of the screen, this is saying, hey, there is something wrong, and we can see we have a render problem. And it's going to say, failed to load app compat action bar with unknown error. Okay. This is due to a bug in the latest version of the app compat library. Now, why Google decided to push this out to the default project that every application or that every version of Android Studio will be making is kind of beyond me. But it is what it is. So there's two ways around it. One is we can go in and we can change the theming to solve this problem, or we can just roll backwards a version. at this point, I'm going to say it's probably easiest just to roll backwards the version of the library and let Google figure out what it is they're going to do. See, it's even going to throw error messages and want me to support those or report those. So it's this guy right here. Where if we go to Gradle scripts, build Gradle, and notice it says module app. Okay, not the project, but the module for our Android application. There's one in here that says implementation com Android support appcompat-v7 28.0.0-RC02. Okay. We're going to just go backwards and change that out to the version before it. Let's just go to Alpha 1. For now, this may change later on in the semester, especially if Google gets their, decides to pull their head out and tell us which way they're going to go, if they're going to fix this or if they're going to force us to change theming. As for right now, they're silent. But if you change that, that should resolve our issue of it not being able to find the action bar code. Now, it'll take a little while for it to do a Gradle build because it'll have to completely dump everything that it had in its incremental build and start over. So you're going to just have to give it a few minutes to run. In the meantime, I'm going to talk about a couple of things here. Now, when it comes to dealing with layouts in Android, we have two big ways to approach this. Number one is the Visual WYSIWYG GUI editor, okay? The design tab. Now, you're probably, thinking, yay, I get a design view for this. The sad reality is, see, Gradle build finished and everything showed up. Is this sucker is glitchy, okay? And getting it to do what you want, exactly what you want to do, the way you want it done, can be very, very frustrating. And coming from what industry has talked to us about as well, they have especially stressed that you're going to spend a lot of your time in the text view still. You can use the design view to make little shortcuts here and there, but get comfortable with doing layouts in this text view. Now, this text is done in XML, so it shouldn't be, a massive surprise to anybody that's done things in XML before. It's fairly straightforward and easy to use. In fact, I find a lot of the times I might use the design view to drop the shell of, whatever UI element I want on the screen. Then I just flip over to the text view and get things laid out the way I want. So you're going to need to be comfortable with both of those, but especially comfortable with the text view. Okay, don't be resistant to the idea of having this text view be a big black scary box that you don't want to touch. Okay, you need to be comfortable with it to be successful out in the real world. So let's look at what we've got here. So at the top we have our parent layout is our constraint layout. Now constraint layouts are extremely powerful. They're one of the most recommended layouts we can use. However, for us to really understand what's going on with a constraint layout, we've got to have a lot more foundation underneath of us. We're going to come to them later in the semester, but for now I need to start a little bit simpler with you guys when dealing with layouts. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to change that to a linear layout. Linear layouts function much the way the name implies, that they allow us to put things, side by side in a line. Now we can tell it, whenever we do a linear layout, we also have to provide an orientation, and that orientation can be horizontal or vertical. Now horizontal orientation means put things next to each other side by side. A vertical orientation means let's put things on top of each other. Now since we're not doing constraint layouts, we're going to go ahead and get rid of the layout constraints that were on this text view. So now I have a text view and I have this lined up in a vertical orientation. So for example, if I wanted to do another text view with a width of, let's say, wrap content, height wrap content, which means take as much space as you need, and let's put text that says, text view number 2 for now. Okay, come back to the design view. Oh, where'd my mouse go? There it is. And now you can see these are stacking on top of each other with a hello world and then a text view number 2. And we could stack these as many as we wanted. You can see as I keep dropping more ones in, things are stacking on top of each other, top to bottom, because we're in a vertical orientation. However, if we come and change this now to a horizontal orientation, in the design view. Now notice everything stacks up on a left to right. Okay, but the power of a linear layout comes when we can start to nest them, and that's how we're going to start to create really interesting effects. Now, one of the cool things, and one of the things that makes linear layouts actually incredibly powerful, is they're almost infinitely nestable with next to zero costs. I mean, there does come a point where you can nest them so deeply that it will cause an issue. But the reality is a lot of times you're going to lay these things out in a layout, in a linear layouts, get the layout the way you want it, or maybe even using some of the other layouts as well. And there's automated tooling that Android has present to then convert those things into constraint layouts. But constraint layouts are really hard to think in. Linear layouts are really easy to think in. So this is where it'll become a really powerful tool for you, is because this will let us figure out how to lay things out, and then later on, once we're more comfortable with constraint views, we can just automatically switch this stuff into a constraint view, and that's really powerful. Okay. In the meantime, though, let's put this back to vertical. Okay. Now, let's also get rid of some of these text views. We don't need quite so many of these things. And there we go. A couple of them there. Okay. They can go away. So now you can see, for example, these guys stack on top of each other. But what if I wanted one here and then maybe two columns side by side like this? And that's where this nesting would come into play, because I can now put in another linear layout. Okay, my width now, though, if I want this linear layout to take that whole screen width, I'm going to say the width is the parent and the height wraps the content. Okay, now what that means is for the width of this, okay, we're going to tab that in, make indentation, make it look nice. Okay, and notice they even give you colors so you can make it a little easier to see what hooks together when you get into big files like this. This linear layout now is going to be as wide as my screen, or the parent layout, which was also set since it was the root going all the way up, right? Okay, so make it as wide as possible, but only as tall as you need to be. Okay, and then let's set this orientation to horizontal. Okay, so now we can, in fact, why don't we just do this? Let's copy and paste. That would be a little bit faster. Text view, part 2. Okay, in our design view, now we can see these coming side by side right here. Okay, however, what if we wanted these guys to, maybe actually be in columns where one was half the screen and one was half of the screen? In like CSS, for example, or in HTML, you would tell it that the width is 50%. However, that doesn't exist in Android. Rather, we have to learn to think in something called layout weights. Okay. Now, layout weights are going to be the weighting that affects within the container. So a linear layout is a container. A constraint view or layout is a container. A frame layout is a container. Okay, it's what we sometimes call a view group. It's something that holds a whole bunch of independent views together. So when I set weights on these individual text views, they are going to be relative to the parent that holds them. So if I was using weights to this piece and to this piece and to these pieces, right, we've got to know that order of how they work together. Okay, so let's take, though, instead of saying my width is wrap content here, this is where it's going to be a little funny. We're going to set our width to 0. Now 0, and then followed by DP. DP stands for density pixels, because in Android, we don't think of things in actual pixels because every screen has a different density. Meaning, an inch on one device might take 400 pixels, and an inch on another device might take 150 pixels. So density pixels allow us to define those things independent. So it gives us a common standard independent of the screen density of an individual device. Okay. However, whenever we use a width or a height of 0, we now have to also provide another attribute called a layout weight. Okay. Now, layout weight is a number that we are going to provide. So this guy has a weight of 1, and layout weight also of 1. Okay. Now, since they both have the same weight, they're each going to get half of the screen. Okay. Because if I add all of my weights together, I have 2, and this guy gets 1 of 2, which is half. Now you might say, well, why don't I get 30% or 50% or 75% like we've done in the past? Google decided to go this way because it provides more flexibility as you're designing and changing. You can just give the weights. You might have to plan them out a little bit more, but it's a lot easier than having to change, say, like 50 different things to make sure you still add up to 100. Or dealing with the problems that come when the weights don't add up to the 100% creates a lot of complexity on how the device is going to deal with those things. So they allow us to just define weights like this. So now they're in 2 columns. Or if I wanted this guy to say take 2/3 of the screen, I'm going to give him 2, and this guy gets 1 for a total of 3. So the other one gets 2/3 of the screen. Or I can give them both 2. And now they're 2 and 2 is 4, so 2 of 4 is 50%, and I'm back in 50%. Okay, so those weights are going to let us control the ratios of screen size space that they're going to take. Now that same ratio doesn't just apply to widths, but we could also now apply it to heights. If I had something I wanted to take, 50% of the screen vertically, I would apply 0 dp to my height and 0 dp in those cases and set the appropriate weights, and I can control how much space something is taking vertically as well. So when you think of what you're going to be asked to do with your homework assignment, when you go and you look at that, for example, you'll have some boxes and layouts that you're going to need to do to be bigger than others, and some will be smaller than each other in terms of both widths and heights. Okay, and you're going to have to work with those ratios to get that set to work kind of the way you want it to work for this particular assignment this week. Okay, but these are going to be the first basic pieces to dealing with layouts. As linear layouts and text views are going to be the first basic pieces for dealing with layouts in Android. We're going to go a lot more advanced as we go on. But one last thing I want to show you in this video is the design view. So for example, I've got all these text views, but sometimes it's easier to get the basic structure. For example, if I want a button, sometimes it's easier to just drop the button in. Okay, and I can drag it sideways to tell it, no, put it under here next to this linear layout. But as you can see, sometimes like the height, for example, says wrap content, make it as wide as the parent. Let's fix that to wrap content. Make it fit. Okay, and now we get a button. Okay. If we get rid of that weight, we don't need that weight there. And now I can have a button that takes place. Okay, so when we want to drag things in from here, but the last thing we need to know though is when we drop this in, this guy is going to give us a piece that's going to be really important in our next video, is IDs for referencing these. Okay, an ID allows us to find this code later on. So in our next video, when we're going to start talking about fragments, we're going to also need to now wire up buttons so that when I click a button, I can make a behavior happen. And the first key to that happens here actually in this layout definition. An ID will be translated to a random number that Android will develop, or the IDE will set as a constant that we can then reference in our code to find something that was defined in the XML from within our Java, or if you're in Kotlin, you could do it that way too. It's the same place. Okay. So if we look at the anatomy of this, okay, Android : ID equals. Whenever you see an @ sign like this, okay, and it's the same thing if I were to do text, for example. If I were to take this text and we were to extract that string, we could do that. Come on, give me my little thingy here. I know that. There we go. Extract the string. Notice it now says @ string. Okay, @ references a resource. So over in the resource folder, if we come now to values, there is a strings.xml that contains our string name button. Okay, so our @ symbol tells us to reference a resource. Now, when we put a plus in front of it, that means if this resource I'm about to state does not exist, make it. Okay. Then I tell it what type of resource I'm targeting. So in this case, I'm targeting IDs, followed by /, followed by what I'm going to call it. So what I'm saying here is give me a new if necessary, resource of type ID, and let's call it button. Okay, down here at string, I'm saying give me a resource of type string that has already been defined as button, because strings we can't define on the fly like we do with IDs. Okay, so I think that covers everything we need to talk about in the layout basics. In our next video, we're going to start looking and talking about fragments and how we're going to work with them, and how we're going to start making things work together between our user interface and the code of our application.